As the dust settles a bit, let's begin with Geneva, with a document that should never have seen daylight in its original form. The Trump administration's 28-point plan was not some neutral synthesis of Western thinking. It was drafted in large part by Steve Witkoff and Kirill Dmitriev, a close Kremlin insider, and it read like one. It required Ukraine to cede further territory, locked out NATO membership forever, capped Ukraine's armed forces in a way that weakened deterrence, and flirted with a blanket amnesty for Russian war crimes while dangling sanctions relief and a G8 return for Moscow. Kyiv and most European capitals looked at that and saw three things: a reward for aggression, structural weakening of Ukrainian security, and a serious risk of fracturing the Western coalition. Hence the emergency diplomacy. The British, French and Germans tabled a counter-proposal that stripped out the worst elements: no record, no recognition of annexed territory, no legal veto of NATO membership, higher ceilings for Ukraine's army, and the removal of a general amnesty clause. Trump's team under Rubio's chairmanship has now accepted enough of this that the 28 points have been cut to 19, and Zelenskyy can say with a straight face that many of the right elements have been taken into account. That is not nothing. The starting line has moved. Roland Oliphant's outline is helpful because it it crystallizes where Washington, most of Europe and Kyiv are beginning to converge, and the emerging consensus looks something like this: the ceasefire along the current line of contact, no formal recognition of Russia's conquests, but a pledge by both sides not to retake territory by force, talks on possible land swaps beginning from that line with no deadline. This is a Korean armistice logic: no legitimacy for conquest, but de facto consolidation on the ground. As for the security guarantees, which fall short of NATO, no explicit NATO membership for now, but no permanent veto either, a US security guarantee mirroring Article 5 in practice, which with the option of rotational Western forces on Ukrainian soil in peacetime, though not a permanent NATO presence. In effect, NATO in all but name, providing Washington continues to mean it. The fail-safe mechanism: if Ukraine attacks Russia's recognized territory, it forfeits its guarantee. If Russia restarts the war, sanctions relief and any tacit acceptance of current lines are void, and Moscow risks war with the US. That tries to cage hardliners on both sides. Any attempt to game the deal comes with a heavy price. The peacetime Ukrainian army capped at 800,000, which is close to current levels and far higher than the original Trump-Witkoff ceiling. The Versailles shadow is clearly on people's minds. This is designed not to turn Ukraine into a demilitarized victim waiting for round 3. The sanctions and Russians' reintegration, phased sanctions relief case by case with no automatic end date, a pathway back to G8 and wider economic normalization for Russia if it complies. Europeans plainly regard this as a painful bargaining chip, but it is one of the few things Moscow actually wants. The reconstruction and reparations leverage massive reconstruction of Ukraine, with US and European firms taking a central role, Russian sovereign assets remaining frozen until some form of compensation is agreed. This is the quiet financial battlefield. Whoever controls those frozen assets controls a huge part of the leverage over Moscow. The humanitarian steps and the war crimes, starting with the exchange of all prisoners, the return of bodies, and deported civilians, especially children. No blanket amnesty for war crimes, but also no immediate grand reckoning built into the peace text. In other words, relief now, accountability later, if at all. One can see why Zelenskyy calls this doable and why Trump now hints that something good may just be happening. This framework is far less of a capitulation than the original 28-point draft. But there are three hard problems that should sit at the centre of any serious talk. Firstly, Putin or Russia is not on board. The Kremlin's response to the European counter-proposal is blunt, it's completely unconstructive and doesn't work for us, while many points of the original US plan are quite acceptable. This tells us exactly what Moscow is trying to do: to keep the Witkoff-Dmitriev text as the baseline, to use the threat of further offensives and the lure of a quick peace to tempt Trump back towards that baseline, to exploit the differences between Washington and European capitals. Tatiana Stanovyana's point also is a key. Putin feels more confident than he did last year. He sees Ukrainian political crisis, mobilization fatigue, and incremental Russian gains, and assumes therefore that time is on his side. This is not the psychology of a leader preparing to compromise in good faith. Of course he is wrong. The revised frameworks have removed explicit amnesty language, which is significant, but they do not center criminal accountability for Bucha, Mariupol, the filtration camps, the deported children, or the execution of prisoners of war. Those are treated as future optional tracks, not as core conditions. So there is a moral and a legal trap. If you freeze the conflict and phase back sanctions without tying that to concrete steps on investigations, extraditions, and cooperation with the ICC, you have in practice traded justice for peace and quiet. If you ignore individual accountability, you push responsibility up and down the chain of command onto abstract entities, Russia, the West, NATO, which is precisely what international criminal law since Nuremberg was designed to avoid. So one can absolutely make the case that a serious peace is possible, but it must secure territorial integrity in principle, no legal reward for conquest, reintegrate Russia into a global structure only as individuals, not as Russia as a bloc, and at the same time making it comply with law, keeping open and resourced channels for investigating, indicting, and eventually trying specific political and military leaders. At the moment, justice is an annex. It needs to be a chapter. There is, as I said the other day, a bitter Keynesian echo here. Keynes's warning in The Economic Consequences of the Peace was that the 1919 settlement was both vindictive and incoherent. It humiliated Germany while failing to build a durable European order, and in doing so planted the seeds of future catastrophe. He was extraordinarily prescient. This is so on the nail, and he practically forecasts World War II. Today, the risk is almost inverted. A settlement that is too forgiving to the aggressor in practical terms, while dressing itself in the language of justice, has exactly the same consequence. If Russia keeps large chunks of Ukraine de facto, regains economic access, and sees only a handful of carefully selected bad apples prosecuted, the signal to future would-be aggressors is clear: gamble hard, bank what you can, wait for the West to tire. If Ukraine is locked into a frozen conflict with ambiguous territorial arrangements indefinitely under discussion, it becomes the next Korea or Cyprus, and the war simply mutates into a different form. So when Starmer and others repeat the mantra of a just and lasting peace, the two adjectives are not decoration. A peace that is not seen as just in Kyiv will not last. A peace that is not seen as lasting in Moscow, that is, one that can break at will, is not just. So, where have these frantic days brought us? The West has, for the first time, a semi-coherent common template. Washington has been pulled away from a plan essentially brokered with the Kremlin towards a more balanced framework shaped by Ukraine and European allies. Yes, it's not acceptable to Russia, but that can be an opportunity for debate and discussion. Ukraine has defended its red lines on formal recognition of annexations, permanent NATO vetoes, and crippling limits on its armed forces. That is a real achievement given the extraordinary pressure Trump applied. Europe has decided quietly that it will pay a high political price: G8 reintegration, phased sanctions relief, perhaps elections in Ukraine under a peace framework, if that is what it takes to secure guarantees and avoid outright betrayal. But Putin has not shifted his fundamental position: legal recognition of his conquests, a neutralized Ukraine, and a West that treats his demands as a starting point, not a maximum. The guns have not fallen silent. Kharkiv, Kyiv, Odessa continue to be hit even as diplomats haggle over clauses. Justice remains a shadow at the edge of the text, not its spine. We have not yet reached the end of the war in Ukraine. At best, we're at the end of the beginning of the argument about how it should end. A framework is emerging, but unless it anchors individual accountability, protects Ukrainian agency, and refuses to baptize territorial theft as peace, it will be less a settlement than an armistice with an extended intermission.